Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Assalamu alaikum, wherever you are. We have a fantastic panel today on the Tabadlab and Jinnah Institute Policy Roundtable on the Afghan peace process. This is obviously a topic of great interest all around the world, especially in Pakistan. And we were really, I think, lucky to have recently a paper that's been published by the Jinnah Institute, which is really the origin of wanting to organize a conversation around the issue of people's participation and people's ownership within Afghanistan of the Afghan peace process that began now almost 2 years ago. But in many ways, a peace process that some would say began when the conflict began, which is 4 decades old. The Jinnah Institute, which is our partner organization and, of course, one of the most renowned think tanks in Pakistan, has just published a really wonderful document written by a dear friend and one of the participants on the panel today, Amara Durrani. And Amara has written a policy brief for Jinnah Institute that is titled "Leave No One Behind, Including Women in the Afghan Transition." This paper really goes through partly the history of the challenge in Afghanistan. It lays out, in particular, what Pakistan's role could be, some of the gaps in imagination from a policy perspective, both within Pakistan and more widely. And then it lays out, how things can move forward. We thought that instead of reading the paper out, it would be much more exciting and interesting to invite Amara and a group of accomplished and important voices in the region, and particularly from Afghanistan. And so I'm delighted to introduce today's panel. As I mentioned, we have Amara Durrani from the Jinnah Institute. We have Laurel Miller, former U.S. diplomat, currently at the International Crisis Group, and the author of not one but several important documents as far as mapping where this process is. Aisha Khurram, who is an Afghan youth activist, has represented Afghanistan at the United Nations and participates particularly from the youth perspective. So not just women or girls, but really what are the young people of Afghanistan saying, feeling, wanting? And I think Aisha will represent that viewpoint and any other that she wishes to express in our conversation. Also delighted to have Wasma Froh join us. I've been a follower of Wasma's for many, many years, admire the way in which she articulates her perspective, which I think is really important and part of the reason that she's part of the conversation today. And last but definitely not least, perhaps the most important member of our conversation today, at least to me, is Madam Fawzia Kufi. Madam Kufi has been a parliamentarian in Afghanistan, is a parliamentarian in Afghanistan, and most importantly is leading the Afghan women delegation within the Peace Council that is negotiating and engaging with the Taliban in Doha. I welcome and thank all of you for making time and taking part in this conversation. I want to just say one sentence before I ask Fawzia Kufi to explain where the process is and what her perspective is. But I wanted to say one thing before this, and that is that for decades, we've had a perspective on Afghanistan that has been informed by geopolitics and security. And I think that nothing qualifies or captures the nature of the crisis of the conversation of Afghanistan better than the fact that it is a rarity, relatively speaking, for us to talk about the people of Afghanistan instead of talking about the countries, armies, intelligence services, terrorist groups, and those sorts of aspects. So I'm delighted that we're able to have this conversation, and I wanted to commit from my end that in this region and more broadly, it is vital that we not only have this conversation once, but over and over again. So at this point, I just wanted to say that we will be calling on you and other friends in Afghanistan and the region to have these kinds of conversations over and over again, inshallah. Fawzia, please, if you don't mind, you occupy a central role in everything right now. Where is the process right now, and how much of the conversation is about women, is about kids, is about things like polio and vaccinations and COVID-19 in terms of the peace process itself?
No, thank you so much.
Well, that's clearly not a good beginning, but you know, we've developed the habit in this region of figuring out our way through, so we will muddle through. While we figure out Fauzia's connection, maybe if you don't mind, Amara, you know, I started off with your paper. Uh, would you mind just describing really quickly what's the short summary view? It's a long paper. I think it's 13 pages, and in the age of social media, that's like a really long read. So if you don't mind, talk us through, and then I'll take the question that I asked Fauzia back to her.
Sure. Thank you, Musharraf. And on behalf of Jinnah Institute and Tabadlab, I'm very grateful to all the esteemed panelists for joining us today. My personal thanks to Madam Fawzi Kufi to take time out for this. Musharraf, the background to my papers actually goes back to 2 years ago when Jinnah Institute first published its Afghanistan essays, which was a set of essays and pieces written by key policymakers, including my own, in which we articulated a vision for Afghanistan from Pakistan. And in my paper in the 2018 issue, I first raised the woman question in Afghanistan and created the idea that this needs to become part of whatever the peace process that the actors are aspiring for. And so 2 years later, following the peace agreement between the US and Taliban, it made perfect sense to revisit that conversation and to kind of put it on the table that now is the time to make this question a central one. We know what the positions are of the Taliban and of the Afghan civil society. We know that women have been involved in the peace process, in the negotiations in the last year or so. And how are we moving forward with women's structured, very specific role in the peace process, and what could be some of the areas that they need to talk about? And then specifically, Pakistan being a key actor in the peace process. How is, and if at all, Pakistan is approaching the Afghanistan question from a gender perspective, from a women's perspective? Is Islamabad taking this into account at all? If not, it ought to for very specific reasons, which I've listed in my paper, and I hope that we can discuss this at length today.
Excellent. So as usual, one of the things that we're trying to avoid by engaging in this kind of conversation is putting Pakistan at the start or the center of the conversation. But I think that actually captures at least part of the problem. And I know that we'll have speakers attest to that and address that. I can see that Fauzia is back with us, but I don't, well, there she is. So hopefully, same question, Madam Kufi, you're gonna have to yeah, there you go, you're unmuted. Same question. Hopefully the connection works a little bit better this time.
No, my apologies, because I'm using a mobile phone, and with the telephone rings, it disturbs, and I hope it doesn't disturb anymore. So thank you. I just wanted to say that thank you and the Jinnah Institute for organizing this very timely event. And I think you're right, we have to do more of this for many reasons, but one of the reasons is we have to keep the Afghan peace process alive, and we have to continue to keep women in the center of this process. So to refer to your question about where we are, on behalf of Islamic Republic of Afghanistan and the delegation that is supposed to pursue the talks and discussions with Taliban, I can say that we are ready in terms of the logistical, but also in terms of the quality, the narrative of the issue. The delegation has been established since 3 months, since the beginning of the discussions, given the complexity of the conflict in Afghanistan, and the fact that we will have a challenging time during these periods of time when talking with Taliban. What we have done is we have kind of drafted policy level issues that that we are supposed to represent and discuss and talk on behalf of the people of Afghanistan, so to say. Because of course things have changed to the great extent as comparing to the time when Taliban were in power. Afghanistan today definitely is represented by women. You can see here a few very prominent women, even in our discussions before with Taliban in the dialogue, starting from Moscow, which I attended, but also going to Doha, which many women attended, it explains that Afghanistan today is a transformed Afghanistan. So in the discussions with Taliban, we have to really present the transformed Afghanistan. And in that regard, I think we will be having some difficult time ahead of us. But in the meantime, I think given that it's not the government of Afghanistan and the security forces and the people of Afghanistan that on daily basis are the sacrifice of this casualty and the deterioration of security situation, but also the Taliban. I mean, the Taliban and the people who are under their control area. So both sides are the victim. And we're not only talking about figures and number of people who are killed on daily basis, both in our security, but also civilians. But we're also talking about the fact that war has taken a lot of opportunity from the people of Afghanistan. So there is a consensus at the national level in Afghanistan that we have to really go for peace. We have to go for a political settlement with Taliban. Now, the question is, what kind of political settlement? After like 20 years having the institutions, having a constitution, many issues that were forbidden during Taliban time and during the civil war, we have them now. So what kind of peace process do we want? Do we want the peace process that will take Afghanistan back to the time when Taliban were ruling Afghanistan? Or do we want a peace process where we will kind of accommodate all, to the great extent, values that we have kept and preserved for the past 20 years? And so the efforts are from both sides to accommodate the values that we have strived in the past 20 years. And in the meantime, have a political settlement with Taliban, because Taliban, at the end of the day, are part of the reality of Afghanistan. We ignore them. By ignoring, we cannot abolish them. So at the end of the day, we have to really come to a sort of agreement with Taliban. So we have drafted a policy level paper, and from my perspective, we do not see a major obstacle in start of the intra-Afghan negotiations. It's just a matter of, I think, logistical arrangements. We are hoping to start the talks soon.
Fantastic. That's a really such a thorough opening. Thank you for that, Fawzia. Laurel, the U.S. obviously is, in a sense, I mean, one way that I describe this process is that this is a U.S. brokered negotiation and moderation that will lead to a peaceful and stable Afghanistan. But a lot of the expectations, not just around the world or within the US, but even, I would say, at least, from my observation, even within Afghan civil society, and particularly urban Afghanistan, that's not just Kabul, but predominantly Kabul, that the expectation is not just brokering it as a neutral, but certainly brokering it as a partial party and partial to the rights, particularly of women and children, because there have been, without question, gains. To take nothing away from the humanness of the Taliban, the suffering of the Taliban, which I think is a really, important acknowledgement by Fawzia. But this role that the U.S. has kind of almost de facto, been saddled with, is the U.S. going to be able to fulfill that role? And how well do you think the U.S. has done so far?
I don't think the U.S. will meet the expectations of those who want the U.S. to play a role of setting parameters for the substance of a peace agreement and for being ultimately a protector of women's rights, minority rights, and other kinds of freedoms in Afghanistan. I'm not saying this as a policy recommendation of my own. To be very clear, what I'm explaining is my observation of what the politics and diplomacy related to this issue looks like from Washington and in Washington. And I'm also highlighting here what I think is a divergence that could well grow, I think probably will grow, between the role that Washington actually will play and the role that some people, perhaps many people in Afghanistan, would like the United States to play. We've already heard some hints and indications of this from American diplomats who have certainly taken a strong role in trying to catalyze an Afghan peace process, but at the same time have said publicly in various statements that the substance of what a peace deal ultimately looks like is for Afghans to determine. Now, of course, that's also true and right that it's for Afghans to determine what the substance of a peace agreement is. And so there are very positive reasons for saying that. But I think it's also important to acknowledge what the political and diplomatic signaling of actually saying that out loud means. And it's an indication of what I think will become increasingly apparent, which is that the US is likely to have very low standards of its own for what is sufficient in terms of the substance of a peace deal. The US is not neutral at all in this negotiation. One respect in which the US has not been neutral over the past years of trying to get a peace process going is that the US has an not formal alliance, but a close political and diplomatic relationship with the Afghan government. I think we see, and not the Taliban, obviously, the US has been fighting the Taliban for 20 years. I think we're already seeing some shift in that sense of partiality, in that the US has been increasingly willing to tolerate friction and to create friction in its relationship with Kabul in order to try to get a peace process going and initially its own peace agreement with the Taliban. But there's another respect in which the US is not at all neutral in this. The US will look out for US interests in an Afghan peace process, period. Now, some of those interests may coincide with interests of the Kabul side of this equation. Some of those interests may coincide and overlap with those of some of the regional countries. But at the end of the day, this is not a peace process like, say, the Balkans or Northern Ireland or Sudan, where the US played facilitating, mediating roles in other people's conflicts. It's not even like the role that the US played in the past in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, when the US was more of an honest broker than it is now in that conflict, in past American administrations. The US is a party to the conflict in Afghanistan. It invaded Afghanistan to pursue its own interests there, and it will look to get out of Afghanistan in a way that preserves its own interests there. Again, that doesn't mean that some of those interests don't coincide with those of the Afghan people and Afghan political figures. But I think it's important for Afghans. I mean, I think it's only fair to Afghans to be very clear about this reality and to not think that the US is going to stick to very high-minded principles in how it looks at its interests. Now, I mean, I think if you ask many American policymakers and political figures what American interests are in Afghanistan, preserving the rights of women and minorities will be among those interests. But there is in reality a hierarchy of American interests. And as the end of the American intervention in Afghanistan comes closer, that hierarchy is going to be ever more strictly prioritized and ever more focused on what the bottom line of American interests are. And that bottom line is counterterrorism concerns, ensuring that the terrorist groups that still have some presence in Afghanistan, that have external ambitions, meaning could be a threat to the United States or its allies outside of Afghanistan, making sure that they don't have an opportunity to grow, to reconstitute where they have been diminished, and to pose an external threat. And that will be far and away the number one, was the original reason for the US intervention, and it will be the interest that the US prioritizes above all others. So I think that doesn't mean that the US won't want there to be helpful language in a peace agreement that attempts to preserve women's rights and minority rights. But the US, I think, will be much more interested in what an agreement says about the the distribution of power, who holds power, and who can be a counterterrorism partner for the United States in the future than anything else.
Thanks, Laura. That's really thorough, and I think at some level an awfully brutal and honest assessment. And it does obviously. I think it's jarring if this agenda for people, and particularly for women, is of importance to you. And I know it is personally, obviously, to all of us. But it's jarring because, in a sense, what we're saying is the Afghan people need to negotiate this amongst themselves, and those that are weakest or most vulnerable are kind of on their own. That's a pretty stark sort of and jarring statement. What I think the counter to that, Wajma, the counter to that might be that, in a sense, the Afghan people don't really need that much help. What the Afghan people really needed was for the fueling of the conflict to end, because actually, in terms of strength and capacity to reconcile and capacity to organize, Afghan society actually doesn't lack the tools. What the problem has been external imposition of conflict. That being as it may, once the agreement is set, and there are genuine fears about what the Taliban really intend and what they're saying and what they actually intend to do. What are the kind of insurance policies or the things that will mitigate against the risk of some of the important advances that have been achieved in the last 20 years sort of withering away?
Thank you, Zaidi. It's so good to see everybody in this discussion. And as Ms. Kofi said, it's a very timely conversation as the Afghan government, the negotiation team are preparing to talk to the Taliban formally, while there has been a lot of talks there. But before starting that, I would like to actually kind of, because I carry that institutional memory of our version of what peace is and what kind of peace building, and I and my groups and many other women have been part of. And so I want to actually remember the 2008, 2009, when President Karzai had secret meetings with some shopkeepers from Quetta, and it was all behind the scenes. And we found that out, that this guy got a lot of incentives, because he came and he told the president that he had a lot of armed men who want to surrender, and they want to bring this message of peace, etc. And we found out, and I remember exactly the day that we rushed to his office, a group of 40, 50 women, and we said, you know what, whatever you have with the Taliban, bring it to the public. We want an end to this war, and the Taliban need to actually understand that what are we asking for, and also this whole process has to be transparent. So 2008 and then 2020, where we are, we didn't stop there. So I think the most important the readiest group that in Afghanistan have actually mobilized themselves are the women. They have been part of, because they didn't start just when the US started, negotiations. We have actually been part of community-based peace building for so many years. Even when we were working in Peshawar, our work continued, in the villages and in communities in Afghanistan, but even during the humanitarian, crisis. So for me, the challenge is that you have a community-based conflicts, or which, of course, I'm talking about the internal challenges. Huh? So you have a community-based conflicts, their modalities, and then you have a political peacemaking, which is very much being controlled by the US, I believe, and very much Afghans. I actually applaud. If I was the president of Afghanistan, I would not actually get into the deal that the US made with the Taliban, because how can you expect a government to commit itself to a deal which we weren't even a party to? We were not even a signatory to that deal. So actually, this is the huge sacrifice by the Afghan government, I believe, that they actually committed themselves. The prisoners release started. So coming back to my complication is that, you have a community-based challenges or conflicts, which are very much in communities, and there are many internal issues that we have in Afghanistan, besides blaming Pakistan and Iran and many other, even the insurgents from Tajikistan and in wars and so many other insurgents. But we also have our own challenges, and like roots of conflicts also exist. So there's this supply and demand change that I have seen it very vividly. So but what's happening is that the peacemaking, the political peace, is not connecting to the local peace. And that's what I'm afraid, that, you make a deal with the Taliban and then Daesh kind of comes out and continues to kill the Shias. This sectarian, divide that would happen between the Shias and the Sunnis and the Hazaras and the Pashtuns. So that kind of, challenge would actually erupt because we haven't dealt with the real roots of the conflict. Our relationship, I think, with our neighbors have not been actually addressed. I think the major challenges that we need to really kind of start dealing, like literally dealing honestly with our neighbors, and similarly expect our neighbors to deal honestly with us, because this challenge, I'm very much afraid that a peace deal, which would be struck with the Taliban just because the US is pushing us that I'm leaving, you have to get along with each other because I'm not staying with you guys. We might have a deal, but then eventually there's another, maybe a civil war, maybe Afghanistan is taken over by the insurgency, or because from what my conversations with so many people in the ranks of the Taliban who are not ready to talk about it publicly is that they are saying the level of violence that the Taliban are preparing to increase is much beyond what we have today. Like, we had 300 people killed just in 1 week last week. The Taliban are planning to kill actually at least more than 600 people in a week. Because what is the plan is that to make the situation so worse that the Afghan people say that, you know what, we forget about republics, forget about women's rights, forget about human rights. We just need to survive. We just don't want to die every day on the streets of Kabul. And that is where I'm afraid that no matter how strong are these voices of change, this new Afghanistan that you see so many kind of manifestations of, is actually not going to be able to deal with what is that survival mode of Afghans. And the other part that I want to talk about is the asks versus modalities. We have clear asks. We don't want to go back to the, even if I take this process as a peace making, or even if not peacemaking, a political settlement, we have clear asks. We know that we don't want to go back to the same darkness that we were under the Taliban. But what are the modalities to get us there? The leverage that the Taliban have earned with the support of the international partners that they have established in the past few years, I think is amazing. The way the international, partners that have supported the Taliban, I really fail to understand the re-grooming of the Taliban that has been done by so many partners that they have established, and people have been rushing to Doha to do, conflict analysis trainings for them. I've actually, I fail to understand that. So the Taliban have actually earned a lot of, fake legitimacy in my view, which does not exist in Afghan society. So there's this clash that I see. There is an international community that's pushing Afghans to reach to a consensus with a group which does not have support locally.
Okay. I think that's I want to come back to the modality issue, because I think that's really the meat of the conversation in many ways, and I'll bring that question to starting with Fawzia and then to everyone. But before I did, I noticed, of course, this was partly planned, but the youngest panelist has been waiting the whole time, and in a sense, young Afghans have been waiting. Now. Young Afghans who were young, 30 years ago, are now not young anymore. There's an entire generation, I would say Aisha Khurram's generation, that was probably born, if not after 9/11, then not very much before. Their entire life has been consumed by this specific conflict. What is Aisha, just talk to us about, obviously share your view, but also maybe if you could channel and synthesize where young Afghans are. I know there's a difference between urban and rural, but the country has been in conflict for a long time. To the best of your ability, summarize how you feel about this process and how long you've waited for it and what you expect of it, but also how young Afghan men, women, people in the rural areas, people in the cities, what is the youth perspective on this process? And you'll have to unmute your mic before you speak.
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for having me in today's discussion, and I'm very much honored to be part of this distinguished panel. As you know, that Afghanistan's peace process is right now in a very critical juncture. And right now, peace and war is going hand in hand, and all parties to the conflict, especially I'm speaking about the Afghan government and Taliban, they're pursuing this fight and talk strategy. It means that they are trying to get leverage and at the negotiating table by pursuing their war and talk strategy. And right now, a lot of people in Afghanistan, including young people, they are worried about having a substantive peace process rather than just a roadmap for the process. And it means that we need a comprehensive set of ideas that could present a desirable outcome of the peace process for the entire population or the younger generation of Afghan people. And in order to create that, I believe that there is need for a broader spectrum of people to be included in the peace process. I mean, most importantly, the young people, because the notion of inclusivity, it's not only it's not only the token participation of the political groups or the government representatives. It is actually more than that. When it comes to the inclusion of people and important decision-making processes such as the peace process, there's need to include members of the general society that have been affected by the war, and that's how you can gain support for the peace process. That's how you can build. You can work towards a sustainable peace in a country. But the crucial question is how to include a broader spectrum of people beyond political or institutional levels. Considering the young generation of Afghanistan, as you mentioned before, as you know, most of the Afghanistan's population, 2/3 of our population is under 25 years old. And the children who were born in 2001, they are right now old enough to fight and live in the same war, that they do not even know the reason why they are fighting today. And as you know, that the younger generation of Afghanistan, they had no choice but to be handed a war-stricken country, and they have been handed guns instead of pens. But at the same time, Afghan youth, as part of the civil society, they over the last 18 years, they have tried to be a part of the bigger change in this country. They have been the drivers of the main changes in Afghanistan. And right now, I believe that the Afghan youth's inclusion in the peace process, the way they perceive the Afghan peace process, is they have a special they have a special angle through which they see this process, because they are right now frustrated, but at the same time they want a huge responsibility that is ahead of them to be kind of feel like they have the ownership of this peace process. Over the last few months that I was preparing for to deliver my speech at the United Nations, I traveled to some provinces of Afghanistan. I met a lot of young people, and I was always asking them, how do you feel about the peace process, and what are the things that you would be willing to compromise for the sake of peace, because you know that a real agreement of peace is just a document of compromise. So there need to be compromises on both sides. I discovered that a lot of young people, they have this space for admission. They are ready to accommodate Taliban back to society, but they have made this clear that they will never waver on their basic rights, constitutional rights, or fundamental rights assured to them by the second chapter of the Afghan constitution. They were really much or they were very clear about this. But at the same time, I guess that I sense that that we do not know really whether the Taliban will accept the changes that the Afghan youth as part of the civil society brought to Afghanistan, especially to the capitals and the big cities of Afghanistan. And for that, I over and over again emphasize the importance of looking at the peace process as a process that needs to be started from the grassroots level, because Afghan youth are the people who are going to live an agreement that is going to be signed between the our elders or our political leaders at the negotiating table in a few months to come. And we are going to live that peace. We are going to implement the provisions that are going to be included in the peace agreement. And we are going to live with full soldiers of Taliban. So for that, we really need to be included in the technical teams. We really need to be included in the processes, that we at least get the updates about what is really going on about our future, what is being decided. So for that, I feel that the process of healing, the process of acceptance and reintegration shall start at the grassroots level, where young Taliban with young other non-Taliban youth get together. They have to understand each other, and the process of acceptance shall start there. And I really see that Afghan youth, they have still they have cautious hope about the intra-Afghan negotiation that is going to be started. But I believe that the deep-seated aspiration of Afghan people will be realized with an Afghan-led process, and the meaningful inclusion and participation of women and youth in the peace process. And I really hope that the intra-Afghan negotiations start very soon and open a chapter of understanding and cooperation between Afghan government and Taliban. So for the good of this country and for the well-being of its people. Thank you.
Absolutely, and not just for your country, Aisha. I mean, part of the interest that I personally have, and I know that so many Pakistanis have, is that anything that's good for Afghanistan is good for Pakistan. That's hard for a lot of Afghans to understand, given the geopolitics and the very sort of troubled history. But I think I actually, just listening to Aisha speak there, Fawzia, I wanted to bring this to you. I wonder if the Taliban are aware of what has happened to young Afghanistan in the last decade and a half or 2 decades. That young Afghans like Aisha, and not to take anything away from how articulate Aisha is and how brilliant she is, but every street corner in Kabul and Mazar Sharif has an Aisha who is capable, articulate, confident, fully capable of taking this country forward without any help from the Americans, without any favors being done by the Pakistanis or the Iranians or the Uzbeks. That youthful energy didn't exist in the 90s, and it does today. And so I wanted you to talk a little bit about whether or not what part of the conversation, or how much of the conversation with the Taliban will be about explaining modern Afghanistan to the Taliban, and how much of it would be about defending that modern Afghanistan from the Taliban, because I think that's a really important distinction.
Absolutely. No, actually, I think both of my sisters remember when in 2018 there was a 3 days ceasefire announced on the eve of Eid days, and this allowed Taliban foot soldiers and some middle class or middle level commanders to come to the cities using this opportunity, and that basically embraced Taliban. They didn't want to go back to their battlefield. They didn't want to continue fighting. And that's an indication that they're also tired of this war. Speaking about similarities and the differences of Afghanistan today and the peace process that we are pursuing now, and the government and the institutions we have, as opposed to what was in 90s, when in 1990 when there was a kind of a similar peace process, I would like to compare the two briefly so that that gave us a hint of where we are going. Are we in the right path, or shall we fix things that went against the will of the people in this process? And let me say that we understand the U.S. interest. Let me also make it clear that the United States, as Ms. Miller rightly said, came to Afghanistan not because they were interested to save Afghanistan, but they came because there was the 11th September attack and their own security was at risk and people were killed. So they wanted to basically ensure their own security. And Afghans and the Afghan people and our government, and we were in the front line of this battle along with our neighbors in the region in fighting terrorism. So it's a common kind of goal. And post-peace agreement with Taliban, are we going to have a safe, completely safe Afghanistan, or there will be a rise of military extremism, given that Afghanistan, there are more than 25 different military extremist groups that are operating in the region, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan. Are we going to have a safer Afghanistan and safer region post peace agreement with Taliban? This is a question that time will answer, but we already have evidences that the level of the conflict is so complex that even in the process that we are about to start the intra-Afghan negotiation with Taliban, we have had some horrible attacks in Kabul, as a result of which newborn babies and mothers were killed, and nobody was taking the responsibility. So that indicates how complex this war is, and are we going to really have a safe, completely peaceful, prosperous Afghanistan post-peace agreement? This is a question that we have to really wait, and time probably will answer. But on the similarities, in the peace process with Mujahideen in 1990, there was no involvement of the real representative of people of Afghanistan. And this was not happening with a participatory approach. So this was a Geneva-based process, UN mediation, and at the end of the day, the jihadi groups were basically looking at themselves as a winner group, and they did not really oblige to have any commitment in this process. While in this peace process, yes, the U.S. agreement with Taliban, it was better, and the best approach was that the Afghan government, the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, including the politicians and the Afghan kind of elite, the political community, were included in the process as a party from the beginning. This probably would have put Afghanistan's republic in a better position. But now we are here. We have to start really. We have to take this opportunity, right? So we have to really be realistic. We have missed a lot of opportunity, but that does not mean that we have to really sit and do not do anything. So where we are, there is an intra-Afghan negotiation, unlike to 1999, but there is an intra-Afghan negotiation 1990, which includes the representative of people. And we are going to talk about all the concerns of the people of Afghanistan from different walks of life during the negotiation, including of those who are born during war, grown up during war, and their life continues still to be occupied by war, including the concerns of Ms. Khuram, the concerns of Wajmajan, and all people of Afghanistan. We are going to talk that. So we did not have this opportunity before. And I'm hoping that, I understand that there is still a lot of local conflicts, and we have not done enough in terms of community peace building. But I'm hoping that this representation, since the establishment of the negotiation team, we have had a series of consultations with civil society organizations from different regions of Afghanistan to include their voice. I understand we have to do more. We have to really do more in terms of community peace building. But I'm hoping that this representation we have now, to some extent, will give people a hope and build trust over this process. In the meantime, the difference is that today I hope that that the U.S. and our international partners will see how complex the situation in Afghanistan is in terms of the military insurgency, extremism, not only Taliban, but also Daesh and other forces. and they will not abandon Afghanistan. At least, so one of the things we will hopefully discuss during this talk is how our partnership with the international community will be post-peace agreement. And we are hoping that there will be some level of partnership with the world and with the region. And we have a regional consensus. Yes, in 1990, the Soviet Union collapsed. And there was no regional consensus, and Afghanistan was forgotten agenda. But nowadays, today, there is a regional consensus. Everyone, including Pakistan, Iran, hopefully India will also come on board, and they support the process. So because they understand that a peaceful Afghanistan is not only in the political interest of the region, but also in the economical interest of the region. Can you imagine if there was Afghanistan was a peaceful country where people could live in equality and prosperity? To what extent Pakistan would have benefited in terms of using this as a connectivity hub that would connect Pakistan to Central Asia with all the opportunities? So I'm hoping that we use the opportunities that exist. Yes, there are some similarities to the failed experience of our history, to where we failed in our history, to the previous peace processes. And I understand the US is a party to this. So many people do not see the US as a neutral partner. The United States has been supporting Afghanistan, investing blood and treasure in Afghanistan for the sake of their own security as well, to the large extent. We understand that, but in the meantime, we know that we're hoping that this is going to be a pure Afghan talks, Afghans talking to each other. And sometimes, Mr. Zaid, that sometimes Afghans can do miracles, like really talk and overcome the things that were impossible. So I think, the Taliban will, and also the delegation of Islamic Republic will, to some extent, try to start from a position of trust. Because there is no loser in this, and there is no winner. We are all the winners in this process if we succeed, right? So if we succeed in this process, Taliban will be part of a process and they can compete in the elections. Look at all the models from other Muslim countries. Where in the world people will deprive their citizens from education, from opportunities, from economical opportunities? Where in the world, in the rest of Muslim countries, people will try to silence the majority? And let me say, in some of these dialogue we have had with Taliban, they're very sensitive towards the free media. They understand how impactful the free press in Afghanistan is. And they should understand that this free press is kept by the transformed Afghanistan. We have invested our blood and treasure to keep whatever values we have, and we will continue to do so. During Taliban, if a woman was whipped in the streets of Kabul, nobody will knew about it. But today, anything happens, people will record that and share it with the rest of the world. So I think Taliban understand that part of Afghan society, and they will have to adjust with that.
It's interesting you say that, Fawzia, that the Taliban understand that aspect of society. Amara, I wanted to ask you to maybe comment a little bit. You've been involved with now over a decade of track 2 engagement and dialogue with, and including track 1 and 1.5 in terms of your engagement with the Afghan state and the Afghan civil society, Afghan diplomats, youth groups, parliamentarians. The Taliban understand that there's a different Afghanistan, that the young Afghanistan is foundationally and granularly different from what they left behind in 1999, 2000, 2001. But I wonder if you feel whether or not Pakistanis understand that there's a different Afghanistan, because I almost feel like, at least in the region, and there seems to continue to be a vision or a perception of Afghanistan that is not kept pace with what Afghanistan is today. Is that unfair, or is that what you found as well?
I tend to agree with you, Musharraf, on an ingrained sense that Pakistan has kind of missed on the years of civil society development and the real coming of age of Afghanistan as a society, as a coherent state. And this is something that I've tried to highlight in my paper also, through my paper also. In my paper, not only am I, speaking with the Afghan people, I'm speaking with the Pakistani people, I'm speaking with the international community, that this is a society, this is a country that has really transitioned despite the conflict. And that's the incredible part. As a student of conflict, as a student of peace building, as a student of international relations, Afghanistan has proven to be this very interesting case of how its society, and particularly its most marginalized groups, like women and young people, how they, despite the odds, despite the violence, the everyday brutal violence, they have pushed against the barriers. They've created spaces for themselves. They've grasped every opportunity. They've created an agency for themselves. They've created a voice for themselves. And the position that Fozia and her sisters and Wazma and Aisha that they occupy today in the table has not been handed to them in a platter. They've gone through years of processes of social evolution, of growth, of civil society empowerment that Pakistan has also experienced in the last, 40 odd years. And we've shared those experiences with our other regional neighbors. Musharraf, you and I have been part of Jinnah Institute's Track 1.5 and Track 2 with India, where we sit across the table with our Indian counterparts, and we have that kind of complicated conversations with them. But we have not seen how our Western neighbor has also grown as a society, which has an intellectual power, it has an intellectual voice. When Wazma articulates the demand for accountability vis-a-vis the Taliban, when Fozia talks about the need to see Taliban as a reality, you see a nuanced public opinion in Afghanistan where they're looking at the conflict from multiple dimensions. And that demonstrates to you that this is no longer just a statist prism that Pakistan has been used to. Our view, unfortunately, of Afghanistan has been so over militarized, it has been so officious, it has been so led by, advocacy and articulation by the Foreign Office or the military. There have been glimpses in the past, in the recent past, of people to people contacts, parliamentary contacts, but somehow they've just become submerged in the overall politics of the bilateral relationship and the overall politics of the conflict. These, Track 1.5 and Track 2s, these are the only hopes right now where groups from civil society, women, youngsters, media, business people, when they get together, they're talking business. Fozia and I have been part of Track 2. We've drafted rules of business and business and statements, joint declarations for both our governments as to how civil society concerns, their agendas, women's demands can be incorporated in the ongoing peace process, and especially within the structures of the bilateral relationship between our two countries. So I think a big barrier has been how Pakistan has not really Pakistanis as a whole have not tuned into the Afghan media. And interestingly, it's the exact opposite in Afghanistan. A lot of Afghan people easily watch Pakistani and Indian content, but how many Pakistanis are following Afghan media content and programs and voices? Social media has been a game changer. I've come to know so many Afghans in my field. I've come to know, and I've forged bonds with so many Afghan professionals, people, young people, women, through Twitter. It's incredible, and I think these are the new media tools that Pakistan as a country needs to take cognizance of. Enter into new programs, into new collaborations that explore the civil society linkages. That it's time to humanize the relationship, to get to really know our Western neighbor in full, and to see how much we have in common.
So Amara, I want to take the conversation to Laurel, because I know that she has a couple of things she wanted to add on to and respond to, from the flow of the conversation. But I just want to press on one issue a little bit, which is, obviously it's been quite amazing to watch, as I said earlier, to watch and learn from Afghans about how fiercely resistant really Afghan society is and has been to withstand what Afghanistan has gone through for as long as it's gone through it, and for this society to produce anyone from Ashraf Ghani to Wasma Farokh. Like, it's a remarkable I think statement to Afghan capacity and Afghan society. But all of this knowledge and all of these bonds that we may have, or this admiration, what will it count for much if the peace process itself and the dynamics of the peace process don't deliver enough space and time in terms of peace? Because that really, I think, is part of the question that Wajma's raised, and one that I want to take to Laurel. But just quickly, if you could comment on that, Amara.
Musharraf, my studies of peace processes, Afghanistan being one process that I've studied, there are, we've looked at the India-Pakistan peace process. I've been part of the India-Pakistan Peace Forum that has, advocated for peace between our two countries for decades. And we believe that the political process itself is influenced to a great deal by the agency of the non-state actors, the civil societies, the publics in both the countries or other countries, whoever are involved, that really, influences. And when you've got governments that in today's age, public opinion matters. For President Ashraf Ghani, Afghan public opinion matters. And for the Taliban also now, Afghan public opinion matters. For Islamabad, Pakistani public opinion matters. I think this is where it is important that initiatives by publics, by civil society, they have to step up their act. This is exactly why I wrote the paper. You have to acknowledge the agency and the influence that we already have, what I call the gains. How do you leverage those gains? You press upon those actors. You take your agenda to the table. You tell them that, look, this is what we are. This is what our asks are. And we are the stakeholders. And you do it through networks, through regional networks, through international networks, to local networks. But this is exactly how civil societies, influence peace processes. We've seen this in Latin America. We've seen this in Africa. We've seen how, in Africa, women in Liberia transformed the conflict in that country. When they decided to, step it up. So I think they civil society actors like women, like youth, media, they do have an increased agency. This is not the 1980s. This is not the 1990s. This is not even the first decade of the 2000s. We are really in the age of social media, where voice matters.
Yeah. Well, so Laurel, Amara says voice matters and is pretty confident that there's an internal, inherent resistance and capacity to resist. I'm a little more concerned, and maybe I don't want to call myself a pessimist. I wouldn't engage in this conversation if I didn't believe in the power of these conversations. But I'm just not sure we figured out or we know enough about the process to be assured. And I think I share Wasma's kind of concern. Is there anything about the process that you feel assured about vis-a-vis creating the space so that some of this resistance that Amara's pointing to has enough oxygen to stay alive, not necessarily to thrive, but at least to still be around?
Yeah, I think there's some really important questions about how the process is being structured and how it can be structured in a way that enables the voices that Amara was referencing to be heard and to actually play a role in the peacemaking. I thought Wajma made some really important points in her initial comments, including the distinction that she drew between what she called political peacemaking which I think is a good term to use for that kind of top-down, formal peace process, peacemaking, and something that I think the term, Wajma, that you used was more community peace building. I may not be getting, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but maybe what some others might call sort of social reconciliation, or a reconciliation aspect of peace building. There's a linkage between that question of whether there will be a peace process that brings together those two elements and the comments that Amara was just making about the roles for specific voices, specific constituencies in the peace process. I think I'm not optimistic that we're going to see, at least in the near term, a structure for the peace process that enables the bringing together of the political peacemaking and the more people-oriented, people-centered peacemaking. At the end of the day, if there's actually going to be peace and stability in Afghanistan, it is not going to come through the formal political peacemaking. That sets the conditions. It can help set the conditions for it. It can help end, or at least reduce the fighting, but it's not going to, in and of itself, make peace in Afghanistan. It's very limited, really, what a formal peace agreement can do, unless you also have that much broader reconciliation component. It's true, as Amara was saying, that there are other examples of peace processes around the world that have tried to bring these together. I know that there are a lot of people in the discussion on these topics in Afghanistan that reference the Colombia peace process, which was the resulting agreement had a lot of elements related to reconciliation and getting at the deep grievances and drivers of conflict. Now, if you look at implementation of that agreement, that's maybe not so many reasons to be optimistic about it. However, I don't personally think that is a good example for Afghanistan. I don't think it's likely that there will be that kind of peace process in Afghanistan for reasons, Musharraf, that you alluded to. Is there really going to be the time, the space, the support from the external parties who are relevant to this, not to mention, the Taliban and some of the other, and not only the Taliban, among the more political inside parties. That kind of peace process, such as you saw in Colombia, much more complicated, much longer lasting than I think there's time for in Afghanistan. Many parties, a multi-100-page agreement coming out of it. And, probably, unfortunately, I don't think there's the time for that now in Afghanistan, and I don't think there would be the international support for that. And this relates to another important point that Wajma made that I wanted to highlight and react to, which is her comment about the legitimacy that has been manufactured for the Taliban in the last couple of years, in particular in the way that they have been embraced by foreign diplomats and people going to Doha, and they're traveling around, etc. I think, the reason for that is very clear. It's that the external actors are desperate for a political settlement in Afghanistan. The external actors who have been those who, like the United States, who've actually been fighting the conflict, have absorb the reality that they didn't win the war, and do not believe that the Afghan government left on its own can win the war. And therefore, they are looking at the peacemaking process in much narrower terms than we've been talking about here, which is, what do you have to do to make a deal with the combatants? And not looking at it in terms of what is the degree of the Taliban's popularity in Afghanistan. That doesn't even enter into the calculation, really. Not saying people aren't aware of it, but it really doesn't enter into the fundamental calculation, which is, how do you make a deal with the combatants in order to reduce violence and have some kind of new governance arrangement, and then sort of hope the rest of it follows. So, you know, I do think it would be a much better peace process if as much as possible of the reconciliation element can be brought into it, or at least, you know, in my view, I think at least try to create some space for that to happen beyond a peace agreement. Try to create some mechanisms or processes that can last over a longer period of time beyond a political settlement style peace agreement, so that you're at least creating the you know, the seed for that to happen. Because as I said at the outset, I'm not optimistic that that's the kind of peace process that there's going to be over the coming months or even couple years.
So, Laurel, that's you know, I think an excellent segue for something I wanted to, you know, bring to Wasma. Look, we have, I mean, at one level, it's kind of relatively simple, right, Wasma? We have, you know, in the Jinnah Institute paper that Amara's list of these instruments, and it's actually remarkable, going back all the way to 2001, Ministry of Women's Affairs, Afghan Independent Human Rights Commission 2002, Constitution 2004, Elimination of Violence Against Women Law 2009, Afghanistan's Transformational Decade Plan, National Action Plan for Women, Peace, Security under UNSC, and then the Anti-Harassment Regulation and Family Law in 2016. You have it in Afghanistan already, all these instruments that are the guarantors. And in a sense, the argument between, you know, the emirate versus the republic, I mean, that's the answer. The republic is important not because anybody likes Amrullah Saleh, and Afghans may, and if they do, that's fine, and you should express that. But, you know, from a Pakistani perspective, the choices aren't really about the individuals or the tweets that, you know, we may see once in a while. The choices are really about a structure that is similar and relatable for Pakistanis, for example, and for Americans, and for, you know, any other country, you know, in the region, or choices that produce an Afghanistan that is unrecognizable structurally. So at some level, this shouldn't be so hard to explain to people. Wasma, talk a little bit about why this part of the conversation doesn't get talked about, neither outside Afghanistan, but sadly, not even within, at least in terms of the conversation we follow. So much of it is about, you know, what the ISI did, or what the Iranians did, or what the Americans are doing. I'd like you to just, you know, delve into this a little bit.
You know, even if my list is longer than Amara's, having followed up every single achievements we have made since 2001. But again, at this, you know, juncture of time, I'm sitting here and thinking, all we have done in 20 years here is not actually driving the conversation around peace in Afghanistan, or the negotiations with the Taliban. And the reason is that this whole negotiations are anchored on a foundation that, you know, we have to reach to a consensus, to a deal, to a settlement, because the US is leaving, Afghanistan will be on its own. And on the other hand, and the Afghan government may not have the right capacity to actually deal with the, you know, the Taliban without the US. That's actually the major, I think, the real crux of the matter. So it's not that the Afghans are coming up, so it's not that these voices are not strong. So my concern is that no matter how much, you know, resistance, consultations you have around the peace talks, if they do not channel themselves into that settlement they talk about, it's not going to end up an inclusive process. So whatever we are talking about, no matter how many great women like Kufi we get in the negotiation, but if the negotiation at the end of the day says there needs to be an interim government by the Taliban, and that's where the Islamic Emirate comes into being, we do not have any resistance power to actually overthrow that. And this goes back to our capacity. I have to be very honest that the governance challenges are very major in Afghanistan. And that has to do with a lot of, so the Taliban are just, for me, the Taliban are 50% of the challenge. The other 50% of the challenge remains with, you know, the remnants of this civil war that we have, the warlords. It's not just the Taliban who don't like women. We have actually other people, even some men in suit and tie, within the government and even outside, who do not believe that we should be part of any conversation. They're actually scared. When they see our names in conversations, you know, they send messages that I'm not going to show up in this conversation, because they do not have, I think, the reasons to actually fight with us, but at the same time they don't have the commitment to even agree that, okay, I cannot, you know, fight with you on this issue, or I cannot argue with you. At least I should kind of, you know, get along. So we have, you know, the Taliban are just one part of the problem. The other part is also the governance challenge that I believe is also quite, you know, high in Afghanistan. So what is happening is that we need to, for now, my perspective is that we need to strengthen the modalities. The challenge is that because we have a coalition government still, Dr. Abdullah is one wing of the government, and because he has been contesting the elections, so then, you know, the fear of losing $1 billion US, all that, there was a lot of, you know, push that, and also internally push by people that, you know, we need to bring Dr. Abdullah back into the state structure. So when he is in the structure right now, there is, you know, this National High Council of Reconciliation, you have a High Peace Council, you also have a Ministry of State, you know, so we need to actually kind of bring clarity on how each of them need, like, kind of reconcile with each other, how each of them work with each other. So just consultations, in my view, is not enough, because we need to put these modalities in place. And I worry that we do not have those capacities, because you have to see that this is, we have been fighting this war. We have been surviving our lives. How can the world expect that we suddenly turn into peace experts? No, we cannot. So we need the support. Like other countries, you know, I was in Mindanao, Philippines, and I saw how Malaysia, you know, this huge group of international partners supported, you know, the Philippines government into coming up with, you know, a peace agreement with an insurgency of just one province. And that insurgency was for like 25 and now even 28 years. Looking at Colombia, so I think the world needs to understand that we should not expect Afghans to accept that they will be on their own, be able to manage the country on their own, and then also fight these 25 other insurgent groups from all over the world, and make peace as well. I think this is too much for Afghans. So the capacity is a major challenge. I believe the existence of international, and this is what I was, you know, advocating with the NATO's yesterday, that we need to bring in international, you know, expertise, just the way other peace processes in other parts of the world have run. You know, we need monitors. We need, you know, a strong monitoring from outside, from inside. We need to, you know, provide support and resources for the women groups, for the civil society, and all these voices of resistance to actually have a leverage. Because right now we do not have a leverage. We do not have, we are not, you know, blowing up ourselves. We are not security threats for anybody. So our voice, no matter how much, you know, widespread is, but still it's not going to determine the end results of this political settlement.
So, you know, I mean, that kind of aligns with I think the fears that Laurel has articulated, and in a sense you've confirmed. Aisha, while I was listening to you, I felt quite hopeful, because you were talking about, you know, your willingness and you know, wanting to engage with youth that may be on the Taliban side. What would be the format? I mean, I'm sure you've had discussions. It seems to me like there's still enough time, because it's a 14-month period, and we're only 4 months in. So we have more than 10 months to develop some kind of a momentum that helps protect aspects of the Republic, if not the entire Republic, certainly the aspects we've talked about in terms of a rights framework. But in terms of negotiating that part of the conversation, I think it'll be young people like yourself that would need to be in the conversation in order for that conversation to produce output. Is there any chance of people like Fawzia Kufi? Is there enough of a voice for the youth in the formal structures?
Well, first of all, I would
Aisha.
come to yes. First of all, I would come to your first question, the first part of your question, which was about engaging with young Taliban. You have spoken about the new generation of Afghanistan, the changes that the new generation of Afghanistan as part of the civil society brought to Afghanistan and their communities. But we should not forget one part of the reality in our Afghanistan, in today's Afghanistan. The young people who are living in marginalized areas, in local areas, and urban areas that they are living right now, they are facing with multiple problems. They do not have access to education. They do not have employment opportunities, and even beside the presence of Taliban who shelter behind civilians in their houses, they also face with another problem, which is airstrikes that also increases insurgency in rural areas. And that's the reason I always emphasize that we should not fight against terrorists. We have to fight against terrorism. It means like we have to find the root of the problem, which is the lack of job opportunities, which is the lack of education in rural areas. So a lot of young people, we have the majority of our population is young. So Taliban are using this young population as a fuel to their war. And unless we have this young population, unless we address their grievances as well, unless we reach out to them, and unless we reintegrate them into society, we cannot ensure that we will have a long or a lasting peace. And for this, I always emphasize that we have to link the Taliban youth with non-Taliban Afghan youth. Because we are not going to live with the Taliban who are right now at the Doha, Qatar. They might be moderate Taliban. They have expressed their flexibility in regards to women's rights, in regards to the human rights to a level. But the Taliban who are actually living in marginalized areas, they have misconceptions about us, about the civil society, about the new Afghanistan. And unless they are not addressed, unless they are not linked with the new Afghanistan, they will carry the same grudges, and eventually peace will be only translated into a break between two conflicts. And in order to prevent that, I again suggest that, and suggested again and again, that we need to link those marginalized areas with the privileged areas of Afghanistan to some extent. But again, I know the obstacles in front of this idea, because foot soldiers of the Taliban are their fuel of this war. They are their power, and they are kind of brainwashed in a way that they cannot accept to even sit in a table and talk to other young people. As we saw that in 2018 ceasefire when they came to the cities, but after that, for a long time, they rejected to have this ceasefire, because somehow their perception about the new Afghanistan might have changed if they reintegrate to the new people, the new generation of Afghanistan. As I spoke to young people, they always say that the one thing that we will compromise is power sharing. We will accept Taliban as part of the government, because power sharing will protect the survival and interest of all conflicting parties, and that will be the most reasonable compromise we can make. And but again, we are not sure that Taliban, is there any admission space from the Taliban side as well, because we do not know whether they will accept to be part of the coalition government, because they are very strict. They are very strict about their red line, which is the Islamic government, the format that they want. Everything is unclear, and that leads us to start and step into a process that we do not even can envision a desirable outcome of it, because of the uncertainty that is happening. But right now, what I witnessed is that women's inclusion and youth's inclusion in the peace process is often perceived as a gift to be granted. It means that we are kind of perceived as people who needs to be included, because this inclusion is perceived as a privilege, while it's right of the Afghan people, and I mean especially the women and the young people who were the potential of Afghanistan, not only the half of the population or majority of the population. So I believe unless we include young people, unless we have their perception in the peace process and the what they want as and what they consider as their red lines, unless we include them as in the agreement as provisions, we cannot have a real peace, and that will be only a shift in the ship of conflict, which I'm afraid that might happen if we continue to exclude young people from the peace process.
Absolutely. Look, I want to bring in a couple of questions that have come up on YouTube. One of them, is kind of relates to what Aisha just spoke about with respect to, again, I think I've been impressed by all the speakers, but particularly Fawzia, Wazma, and Aisha, in terms of the humanity with which they've spoken about the Taliban. I've been struck by that. And I think that in keeping with that, Haji Zada Ajmal has asked, even if peace prevails in Afghanistan, who will guarantee that ISIS-K, and then he's put in brackets Haqqani, which is interesting, will not continue its insurgency in Afghanistan? I wanted to bring that question to you, Laurel, and then I'm going to come back to you, Amara, because I want to answer is in the recommendations. But Laurel, this fear that I think quite legitimately the Afghan government certainly has, but I think maybe even the Taliban, at least aspects of the Taliban, would have about Daesh. What is?
Yeah. Sorry, did you finish the question? You cut off a little bit, but I think I got the main thrust of the question. I mean, look, I think the idea of guaranteeing anything about the security situation and the prevention of violence in Afghanistan is too strong an idea. No one is going to guarantee this or be able to guarantee this. I think with regarding the ISIS Khorasan branch in Afghanistan, the US and other external parties, the NATO countries in particular, have, I wouldn't say they're relying on the idea entirely that both the Afghan government and the Taliban oppose that group, but they're certainly encouraged by that, and the kinds of issues related to terrorist groups that the US will be most concerned about in the aftermath of a peace agreement, or in what it's trying to see be achieved through a peace agreement, is not going to be focused as much on ISIS, because that is seen as a problem that is largely contained within Afghanistan, or within also the Afghanistan-Pakistan border regions, and containable by the Afghans themselves, because there is strong opposition to ISIS. So far, the ISIS presence in Afghanistan has not posed any threat outside of the US. Now, I mean, of course, the US doesn't want to see this grow in any way, but that doesn't mean that so long as the problem is contained within Afghanistan, I wouldn't see the US or NATO re-intervening in Afghanistan specifically because of ISIS. That said, I mean, I think there's still an active debate in the US about what is it that the US will feel that it wants and needs and could possibly get out of a peace agreement in Afghanistan in terms of counterterrorism partnerships and platforms for US counterterrorism capabilities in the region. And I think the US will be looking both inside and outside Afghanistan for those kinds of partnerships and capabilities in the future. I just wanted to, because I know we're coming to the end, say one word on a point that flows from some of the last comments that Wajma made, in particular about and also Amara's and Aisha's comments too, in references to other peace processes. I think it is, given the complexity of the issues we've been talking about today, the number of voices that need to be somehow heard and corralled in a peace process, and the complexity of the issues, it is unimaginable to me that there could be a successful peace process without some kind of neutral mediator or facilitator. I think as a process matter, that is absolutely essential. And I think it's a tremendous mistake on the part of the Afghan government that there has been a real lack of enthusiasm for that idea. I think the Afghan government and the Afghan people would really benefit from that, and that it would also create a way for the process to be more durable beyond the upcoming US election in November, when US policy could change, when no matter who wins, US interest level in Afghanistan could diminish even more.
Yeah, that's interesting. Although, I mean, there's a part of me that wonders whether, if there's a Biden administration, whether that interest would diminish, or whether we'd see kind of a Obama 3.0 kind of setup.
3.0. I mean, what you would see is more likely to be what Biden's view was during the Obama administration. And he was a dissenter from the Obama policy. And that's, I think, very important to remember.
Excellent. Amara, you know, you've kind of addressed pretty much all of the points that we've been talking about. But again, going back to this, the guarantor of at least keeping ISIS-K at bay, in your Jinnah Institute paper, you've got very, I think, detailed recommendations for Pakistan. And I love the word demilitarize and humanize the bilateral relationship. And then when you talk to the Americans and their allies and multilateral fora, you have 3 key recommendations. Instead of me reading them out, just talk us through that specific aspect as a guarantor of some degree of stability. And just to remind you that we're really running short on time, and I want to bring in Aisha and Wajma as well. So some closing remarks, including how you would address the threat of terrorism.
So I think when you look at the recent policy statements that have come out from the Taliban, from the Kabul government, and also from the Pakistani government, there's been a lot of what I'd call common talking points on seeing Daesh as a common threat. And when you have that common understanding, at least publicly stated, there is an underlying assumption that these actors, and you know, the US is kind of the big backdrop actor in it, there's a common understanding that all 3 actors would work together, and then you've got the regional actors putting in support to address the boogie of IS and to do combined effort. And Taliban's role in that, you know, the US has ascribed a very important role to the Taliban to prevent Daesh from taking ground in Afghanistan. I think that is going to be the test for all these actors who are genuinely invested in the peace process. I think it really now is a litmus test for the regional actors to prove their own capability of holding the peace together and to take it to some kind of crystallization for getting Afghanistan on track to some semblance of normalcy. So I think you'll see, because the other feared alternative is anarchy. It's proxy wars. And does Afghanistan want that? Do Afghanistan's neighbors want that? I don't think that's on the table. And I think one of the big, very clear recommendations that I've made, and this speaks to Laurel's point about, you know, how the US is kind of on the retreat. It's definitely taking a subdued role vis-a-vis Afghanistan's future. I personally do not see 100% disengagement or vanishing from the scene, but I've definitely recommended, you know, letting the multilateral actors, the multilateral organizations to kind of step in and fill that kind of supportive international community role that is so needed, that Wajma has articulated, the kind of support that Afghanistan needs, that Aisha has articulated, that Fawzia Kufi. I think that's the kind of multilateral institutional, we've seen the UN representatives meeting the Taliban this week. Now that speaks for the kind of sense of a certain sense of role responsibility that other international multilateral actors are seeing for themselves, an opportunity of how to keep the process in place so that it doesn't become vulnerable to threats posed by Daesh.
So much to say on multilateralism, or rather the corrosion of multilateralism. And again, I think the fact that we have opened the doors to a discussion about November is interesting. It means that we'll have to bring Laurel and all of you back and talk a little bit about the US election as well, hopefully with some more American representation. But that's for another day. Aisha, I just wanted to ask you to sort of share your closing thoughts. And also give us a judgment on this discussion. This is clearly a starting point, but I feel that we need to do more and more of this, and I hope you'll participate with us as we try and do that.
Thank you very much, and once again, thank you for having me, and thank you for organizing this discussion. It's absolutely a timely discussion and very important, as I mentioned, that we are in a very important juncture of Afghan peace process. So we really need to bring up these voices and to actually especially voice the Afghan youths and Afghan women's voices, and include them in these kind of discussions. So I wanted to mention something about the question that was asked before, if I may. This peace process, this peace agreement, intra-Afghan peace agreement that might happen in an upcoming year or years to come, this will not end insurgency. This will not end terrorism and war in Afghanistan. It's obvious. It's just a piece of paper that will be signed. But what is important is to make sure that that we have Taliban on board to fight ISIS or other international terrorist groups in Afghanistan. And at the same time, I believe that I mentioned that with United Nations diplomats or our leaders inside the country, that we need a third party guarantee in order to make sure that this agreement would be credible and really implemented. In order to implement it, we need both a monitor or a verifier to guarantee that the peace process will be implemented, and it will not be just a lip service to Afghan people. And for that, I believe that in order to counter insurgency or other international terrorist groups in Afghanistan and the post-peace situation of Afghanistan, we can the future government of Afghanistan can request from international community to form a coalition that could with the help of Afghan government fight insurgent groups or other international terrorist groups. But with that, I once again emphasize that there is a mechanism in which we can take Afghan youth on board as people, as part of the civil society who can influence the peace process, and at the same time monitor the peace process inside the inside Afghanistan. And with this, I thank you for organizing this discussion.
Brilliant.
And thank you for having me.
Thank you, Aisha. Wazma, the last word goes to you. Give us a wrap up of the discussion and give us a way forward before we thank everyone.
Thank you. I'm not a person who usually reaches to consensus and conclusions, but I'll try. So for me, there are a couple of points here. The Afghan peace process, like everybody keeps talking about, the military is not the solution. So what is that solution? I think this is the chance for Afghans as well as for our partners to actually put some genuine efforts and say that what we have been saying is that, yes, this conflict will not resolve by war and air operations. Then how are we solving it? So I think Afghanistan's situation should be actually kind of a witness to the global narrative about peacemaking. Is it possible to end an insurgency? That's one question. The other point that I want to make here is that I've personally seen a difference between the politics of how the, President Trump or NATO leadership would say with how the soldiers, the commanders, or even, like heads of the US, or NATO forces or in command would react. There is a difference. There is a very clear, feeling among many of them that, especially those who are managing the war, who are managing the operations, that they are saying if the Taliban are going back to, the Emirates or going back to where they were, there is a huge possibility of fighting back. So, but this is not being, communicated to the Taliban. The Taliban think they are going to be the winners. In this sense of, winning has actually overshadowed their, willingness to talk to Afghans and accept Afghanistan's realities. This is a major issue that I think that the Taliban are very much arrogant, is because they think they have won. This whole, a notion of Fateh that they keep talking about, that, oh, we are, and that's what they sell. That's how they keep, recruiting young boys on the ground, that, oh, we are the winners. This is a jihad. We are pushing the Americans out, which, if I think the last point, it will be for Afghanistan's benefit if the US forces leave Afghanistan. I think it will be good for Afghanistan, because what would happen is that today's Afghanistan, will actually start being able to manage its own affairs with how it deals with its neighbors. It might not be a very easy kind of a journey. It will be very hard. Maybe we would have a lot of, challenges in terms of even civil kind of anarchy. It might be there, but I personally believe that it's good for Afghanistan that the US should leave. But it doesn't mean that the world should abandon Afghanistan. And I needs to be kept on the peace process, and I needs to be kept on the Taliban. And last important, I think Pakistan's role, we have kind of talked about it for all my life, but I would continue saying that if Afghanistan and Pakistan reach to a deal, and that's what I'm very serious about, a deal. If I was the president of Afghanistan, I would actually go and talk to Mr. Bajwa and say, let's sign a deal. You talk about Iran, this is what I agree with you. You talk about the waters, this is what I want to agree with you. You talk about, for example, Afghanistan not being used by India, this is how I'm going to kind of shape my relations with India. And similarly, this is what I want from you. Stop sending me your suicide bombers. I think if we reach to a deal with Pakistan and learn, and I actually envision a day where Afghanistan and Pakistan live like Norway and Sweden together. Maybe that day would not come in my lifetime, but I hope at least in the lifetime of my daughter and grandchildren that this would happen, and that's the time when conflict will end in Afghanistan. Thank you.
I think there's no better note than to aspire to not just live as Norway and Sweden, but to exceed the success that Norway and Sweden have had in taking care of their people, because that's why we admire those countries, because they take care of their people. This peace process must take care of the people. This country, Pakistan, where I'm sitting, must take care of its people. And I think that on that note, I will end. I will thank you for your brilliant contributions. It was such a privilege and an honor to listen to you. And if you go back and check all of the Tabadlab's roundtables that I've moderated, I'm absolutely certain I've spoken the least in this one, and that's because the contributions of the panel, were just so brilliant, and I'm really grateful that you all made time. Amara, thank you for writing a brilliant paper, and thank you to the Jinnah Institute for publishing it and for working with us and supporting us on doing this roundtable. Aisha, Godspeed to you and to everything that you're doing. Wasma, always been a fan, a bigger fan now. And Laurel, always amazing to see you, and really you helped give structure and shape to the conversation. In absentia, I thank Fawzia Kufi for her heroic role in Afghanistan. She's not just fighting for Afghan women, she's fighting for the women and the people of the entire region. God bless her, God bless all of you, and God bless all our viewers. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Guys, that was amazing.